Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss how the Governor of the Bank of England and the Chancellor have decided to use a major speech to attack the damage caused to our economy by Brexit, which sounds like a good time to remind us exactly how much damage Brexit is causing in simple figures, and why we should be really getting the government to take the next step and openly discuss these costs. But first, for daily political commentary, please click the subscribe button so you don't miss out. So back in the studio again. Hopefully I can stay here now. But before we get onto the latest in terms of the facts and figures, so what's this about Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England? So both he and the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, gave their Mansion House speech yesterday. Now, this is an annual event, and although it doesn't get much mainstream media attention for itself, you will read about some of the things mentioned in the speeches in the mainstream media. And that's because it effectively sets out how the Treasury and the Bank of England see the main challenges and opportunities where the economy is concerned. And both Bailey and Reeves talked about, amongst other things, the damage caused by Brexit. Both of them. Not really happened before. Obviously, no Chancellor has decided to attack Brexit in their Mansion House speech before because, they've all been Tory Chancellors. They are still wedded to the concept. But even Bailey hasn't put much emphasis on Brexit. I mean, one thing to point out is although the Governor of the Bank of England is independent, they work very closely with the Chancellor and they're not really supposed to stick their head too far out. And also, for those who don't remember, he was chosen by Boris Johnson to replace Mark Carney as governor, specifically because he was willing to go along with the idea of Brexit not being the dumbest idea in history. So he has previously downplayed the impacts of Brexit. Even though there's always been the odd line buried in the details of the analysis, he's never sort of shouted it out before, that I can recall anyway. But here we had him talking about the drag effect of Brexit on our economy. He made it clear that he takes no position on Brexit as a policy. He said, important to remember that, but that it was also important to point out the consequences. He said that the trade barriers weighed down our potential supply and that we should look to rebuild relations with the EU, while he said respecting the decision of the British people. Now, I'm going to come to that later.
Now, I've said many times as a public official, I take no position on Brexit per se, and that's very important. But I do have to point out consequences. The changing trading relationship with the EU has weighed on the level of potential supply. The impact on trade seems to be more in goods than services, which I don't think is particularly surprising. But it underlines why we must be alert to and welcome opportunities to rebuild relations while respecting that very important decision of the British people.
Of course, the best way to respect the decision of the British public, I would say, just in general, is to ask them what it is. What is the decision of the British public? Like, we haven't bothered to ask them. We asked them 8 years ago when they were being sold all sorts of versions of Brexit. We didn't ask them at the point at which we knew what Brexit exactly was going to be, and we haven't asked them since. Now, anyway, in terms of the speech, Chancellor and the Governor, tag teaming to attack Brexit here. You think, well, this seems like a small thing.
And we've faced structural challenges too, including those which have come from Brexit. It will not be straightforward to navigate all of these headwinds. We should be honest about that.
The impact of Brexit is obvious, regardless of people's views on Brexit. It did involve raising trade barriers with the single market. That's undeniable. Raising trade barriers does make trade harder. So, of course, Brexit has meant that we've strangled our supply lines, which means that unless we reduce our demand, the cost of goods especially will increase because our suppliers cannot meet those demands. So the very least we can expect the government and the Bank of England to do is acknowledge those basic facts. And yet hasn't really had the spotlight focused on it before in this official manner. The fact that it was mentioned as a major challenge in managing the economy is the clearest sign yet that although the government have got those red lines, although remember they're really key voters' red lines, it's still a sign that the government are not pretending that Brexit is a good thing. For all those who think Labour are now a Brexit party, there's not a single statement made by any Labour minister which says that Brexit's a good thing or has any benefits. The official government position is, well, we're stuck with it. Of course, it would be nice if they added the words "for now" at the end of that position, but always implied anyway, because no government position has to last beyond the duration of the Parliament for which the position was stated. But yeah, it may seem small, but in the space of this year, we've gone from a government position of Brexit being full of opportunities and we don't need particularly close relations with the EU to one of saying that Brexit is damaging to our economy and we should have the closest relations with the EU possible, while still respecting that referendum. But there's still some distance to go. I would like to see two things from the government, which unfortunately rejoined forces are not asking for, because too many would rather complain they're not getting their unicorn. The first is to acknowledge that the referendum did not call for us to leave the single market or customs union. There's a lot of talk, understandably, on the part of the government saying we can't just say that all the people who voted for Brexit were wrong or stupid or anything like that. Okay. But what did they vote for? They voted to leave the EU. They didn't vote to leave the single market. They didn't vote to leave the customs union. So I would like the government to explicitly state that remaining outside either of those, even if it's government policy, isn't actually a necessary part of respecting the referendum, because the referendum did not cover those things. Second thing I would like from the government is to not simply say that Brexit is damaging our growth prospects. I want them to give me a figure. So either order an economic impact assessment or formally agree that the OBR is correct in saying that our hard Brexit means that our economy over the medium and long term is always going to be 4% smaller than it otherwise could be. And that this means we all have to pay higher taxes and a higher price for goods as a result. Those are what we need next. And the only way to get them is to ask the questions of the government repeatedly. But no, people think we should just keep demanding that we join the single market immediately when there are multiple reasons why it's completely impossible. Never mind, in the short term at any rate. But as nobody is bothering to ask the government what it thinks the impact of Brexit is on the economy quantitatively, we'll just have to defer to the OBR. After all, if the government are happy for the OBR to forecast the impacts of their budgets, then presumably they're also happy for them to forecast Brexit effects. And their latest analysis from earlier this year maintains their belief that it reduces what they call long-run productivity by 4% compared with being in the EU. Now, this figure has held firm for years now. And even though the OBR obviously keep updating their model with the latest data every year, because they do this analysis every year, they keep updating it with the latest trade figures and everything else, their conclusion still remains that the extreme Tory Brexit is stifling productivity by 4%. So what does that mean to the public? Well, many people have talked about how all the hand-wringing over tax rises could have been avoided if we'd still been in the EU. How does that work? Well, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. If the rate of tax as a share of GDP were to have remained the same, what this OBR analysis tells us is that the government last year, because we don't have this year's GDP figures or anything because we're still doing it, but for last year, the government would have had an extra £44 billion of tax revenues. That is basically double the money needed for those 40 new hospitals that the Tories promised but never funded. And I mean new hospitals, brand new hospitals we could have had, not just refurbishment of existing ones. But there's another way of looking at it. It would have allowed for the same level of spending, but £44 billion less in taxes and borrowing. But however you look at it, unless the Treasury wants to do its own analysis, then according to the OBR, which is the most official quantitative analysis we have, we're paying about £44 billion worth of taxes just for Brexit. And this isn't taxes being spent on anything, by the way. This doesn't actually include the money the government's having to spend on things to account for Brexit. This is just money down the toilet. We get nothing for it. It's just £44 billion of taxes we don't get because of Brexit. If that taxation was spread evenly across all households, now it's not. But let's do the media trick and say that it is. It would work out at just over £1,500 extra that every household is paying in tax every year just to pay for Brexit. And what do we get in return for that extra £1,500 a year? Well, as Bailey noted, we get problems with supply. So it's harder to get the goods we want sometimes. And it's definitely more expensive. Because even when you can get the goods, there's the extra cost of transport, bureaucracy, because we have to produce documentation now, and delays, of course, while the documentation is checked and everything. All that is passed on to the consumer. Now, some of us also get the extra fun of having to travel around multiple pharmacies to get a prescription filled because medicine shortages are now way worse. Remember, 80% of our NHS drugs have their supply chains in the single market, so extra costs and delays with those. We pay extra for energy because we no longer have access to the rates of those in the single electricity market. We're also paying more for water because the chemicals needed to treat the raw sewage, which the government are now going to insist takes place, cost more because they come from, single market. Oh, and some people lost their jobs because production investment moved to the EU. And then there's all the other costs as well. There is some government spending, public spending, that is being used to build Brexit infrastructure and manage it. You know, the lorry parks, the extra facilities at ports to make sure they can carry out these checks. All of that costs extra, and all of that comes from taxes as well. So for my money, we should maybe prioritise getting the government to take the next step. And the next step is to state these things explicitly rather than implicitly. You know, rather than demanding they do things which aren't actually possible and just make us look like, as a community, like we don't know what we're talking about. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can join for memberships. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.